Okay, as we continue through this text, we're looking at the particulars of what Jesus has said in verse 9. So the whosoever needs to be understood as a universal statement of Jesus, applying to all people in the world. It's not a covenant-restricted comment, but a general statement about God's divine marriage laws for all people. Then he says next, whoever divorces his wife. This is the same word that is used in verse 3, verse 7, verse 8, is the common word for divorce and is the topic of discussion. There is nothing that should be found in this particular word that would make you think of anything other than the idea of a husband separating himself from his wife, a wife separating herself from her husband. Now, I say that because in just a few minutes we're going to be talking about those who want to reinterpret the meaning of the word adultery in this context. And what are the terms being used and how are they to be understood? In a normal sense or in a figurative sense? Well, a normal sense is the answer.
I think what's on the bottom of your slide? I apologize.
No, I think I might have just done that when I was...
Is that what it says? Land is the topic of discussion in the New Testament, and there's a topic of discussion in this section. 1932.
When I do it normal, it's real tiny.
Sorry, that's fine.
Well, no, it's really not. Let's do a stretch. It makes it bigger, but it also includes it. All right, then he says in the next clause, except for fornication. The word except in the normal usage of language means that this is the only reason that God is allowing divorce. And then remarriage is something that Jesus will talk about in a minute. Up to now, we haven't been talking about remarriage. The word fornication is a word that means sexual unfaithfulness. It is the word porneia. And if you want to spell it out, transliterate it into English characters, Porneia. And it is the word that we get pornographic and porn and, a group of words all based upon this word, porneia. Sexual unfaithfulness. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself. This particular word is an umbrella term. And if you can visualize, and I probably ought to create a screen that says this, but you've got this umbrella top that says fornication or porneia, sexual unfaithfulness. And underneath that includes adultery, lesbianism, homosexuality, incest, bestiality. Those are all examples of porneia. I was preaching in another state, I had a woman that was still very young, very pretty, that had been divorced and had been living single for 5 or 6 years. And in the course of conversation, she had mentioned that she was married but is now divorced, and that her husband was unfaithful to her. And I said, "Why haven't you found another man then?" She said, "Well, I'm not scripturally eligible." I said, "I thought you said he was unfaithful." She said, "Well, he was, but he was unfaithful with another man. He ran off with another man." Said, "So?" She said, "Well, that's not really a sin that it makes me free, does it?" Well, she didn't understand porneia. Porneia is sexual unfaithfulness, and it could be with a woman with another woman. It could be a man with a man. It could be a man with a woman. It could be a man with an animal. It could be a man with a child or a woman with a child. It's sexual unfaithfulness. And it is not, however, a word, I believe, does not include looking at pornography. Because that's, while it's a sexual sin, it is not a divorceable sin. It would not be something that would be included in this umbrella of fornication, because as we understand this word, it's always including somebody else, or with an animal, something else, but still, it's we talked about adultery in the heart. Jesus mentioned in Matthew 5. Well, looking at pornography is adultery in the heart, but is it something that makes the innocent party eligible for divorce and remarriage? And do not believe that would be the case. All right, so just as fornication doesn't make a marriage, neither does it dissolve a marriage. Just because a man is guilty of fornication does not mean that the wife is obligated and bound to divorce him. She might, out of love and mercy, decide to forgive and to accept him back. Now, according, though, to this text, God is giving her, the innocent party, and I'm using her as an example, the man committed fornication, God is giving her that exception clause, that for fornication, he can, in fact, put her away. Now remember that this whole discussion is based upon the question the Pharisees asked in verse 3, can a man divorce his wife for any cause? Now, what has happened in verses 4 through 8 is Jesus laying down some preliminary points that they're not getting. They're not understanding God's original design for marriage. They're not understanding that they shouldn't be in the divorce business. That's God's business. And they're trying to enjoin what God has joined, and they don't want to go there. And they don't understand Deuteronomy 24. They're pitting Deuteronomy 24 against Genesis 1 and 2, and they don't need to be doing that. And so now it's not until verse 9 that Jesus is directly, specifically answering their question, can a man divorce his wife for any cause? Jesus says no, except for fornication. So it is clear that this is the one and only reason, God-approved reason, for divorce and remarriage. Now he's answering their question. And he's answering it in a most specific way. Also, by looking at the wording here, it demonstrates that the innocent party is putting away or divorcing the guilty party. This is the reason for the divorce. All right, then the verse ends, and marries another, commits adultery. Adultery means unlawful sexual intercourse with the mate of another. Now, the difference between fornication and adultery is that fornication, porneia, is that umbrella term of which adultery is one of the examples of fornication. Adultery involves somebody that's married. So, if you got two teenagers that have sex, it's not adultery because neither one of them are married. But when you have one or both that are married, and sexual unfaithfulness occurs, porneia occurs, then the Bible gives a particular term that applies to that, adultery. So whenever the word adultery is used, somebody's married in the equation, the principal parties that are being discussed. Now, all standard lexicons and theological dictionaries define this word moikeia, adultery, as unlawful sexual intercourse with the mate of another. That's the typical general word. Now, as true with a number of Bible words, adultery can be used in sometimes a spiritual or a figurative, symbolic way. For example, in the Old Testament, adultery is sometimes referred to, but you're really talking about idolatry.
Your thing is.
I don't know why it went. All right, so what some have wanted to do is make this to be idolatry, or that the word adultery is used in some Old Testament context as covenant breaking. And so all we're really talking about is covenant breaking. Well, is there a possibility that Jesus here is talking about covenant breaking? First of all, and you have this material in your syllabus notes, there's no evidence to suggest that a figurative application should be applied here. For example, in John chapter 8 and verse 4, they caught the woman in the very act of adultery. Well, are they meaning that they caught her in the act of covenant breaking? No, I think what they mean is they caught her in bed with another man, having sex. Adultery. That's the normal meaning of a word. And this is always a lesson in doing quality exegetical work. is that you always take a word in its normal, typical usage, unless you have compelling evidence to believe that it should be applied figuratively or symbolically. And in this case, we have zero evidence that Jesus does not mean sexual intercourse between, unlawful sexual intercourse between a married person and somebody that isn't his wife or her husband. That's the normal meaning of the word, and we're not taking the word fornication to be symbolic or any other term in this context, so there is no reason to take it that way here. Now, why would somebody even want to go there? This is another example of creativity at its, or creativity gone amok. Because they say, really all we're talking about is covenant breaking. And you're engaged in covenant breaking whenever you sin. Because you said Jesus is Lord. Well, whenever you do what your Lord doesn't want you to do, then you've broken that promise. You've broken that covenant that you made with God. And so what do you do when you break a covenant? What do you do when you've sinned? Well, you tell God you're sorry, you ask Him to forgive you, and then you move on. You try to do better. Well, that's the way it is with marriage, so they say. That's all it is with marriage. You mess up, you're engaged in a marriage that just didn't work out. You tell God, I'm sorry, it didn't work out, and then you just move on. Find another woman and you try to do better. Well, what happens if it doesn't work with that woman? Well, you've broken the covenant again. Tell God you're sorry. Find you another woman and then try to do better. And so with wife 3, and so with wife 4, and so with wife, it just goes on and on. But there's nothing in this text that would even suggest that covenant breaking is what is in mind. And I would point out that the Greek language had two words, diatheke and syntheke, that meant covenant. And so if, in fact, we were talking about covenant breaking, why not use those words that mean covenant? Why use a term adultery that is clearly going to send us down the wrong course? Now, I've done this many times through the years when I ask Greek scholars that if Jesus were wanting to say unlawful sexual intercourse with the spouse of another, that's what he was wanting to say, what word would he have used? Every single time, and I've asked this question probably to 30 Greek experts, every single time I get the exact same answer. The very word he used here. If that's what he was wanting to say, this was exactly how he would have said it. So, that's the way that we need to take it. And not try to get creative and come up with some way to reduce or eliminate the teachings that Jesus is giving here. Now, the conjunction and, he says, and marries another, shows that Jesus is not here concerned just about the sin of divorce, but with the practice of divorcing and remarrying. Now, I think all of us, if we just apply some common sense, some horse sense to this, know that the Pharisees are teaching what they're teaching because there are men out there that they want to find another woman. They're not just wanting to get rid of the woman they've got now. They want to get rid of her and get another one. Very rarely is there a man that says, I just don't want to be married. I'm married now, and it's not a happy relationship. I want to get rid of her, and I just want to live single. Occasionally that happens, but most of the time there is the thought, even if there's not another woman in the picture right now, there is a thought that eventually there will be. Eventually I will find another woman, and I want to be able to marry her. So Jesus is going ahead and beating him to the punch and saying, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Now another point. Jesus does call the second union a marriage. But it's still an adulterous marriage. I've had people say, Bible calls it a marriage, so it must be God approved. If God's going to call it a marriage, that settles it in my mind. It's a marriage. Yeah, it calls it a marriage, but it's an adulterous marriage. It's not a God-approved marriage. Just like Herod and Herodias, the Bible confirms that they were married, but she still belongs to Philip in God's eyes. So don't let that particular argument win the day because it's just not accurate. The Bible is using terms that we understand, that this woman divorced her husband and married another man. Well, but she can't do that, but she did anyway. And so it's calling it a marriage, but it's not a God-approved marriage. All right, the exception clause sometimes throws people off. This is what you need to do. When you have an exception clause, and we talked about this in Matthew 5:32, so this is repetitive information here. You take out the exception clause, then the entire statement remains as it stands. So, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Boom. That's it right there. You divorce, you marry another, that's adultery, that's that. Now, what would allow somebody to divorce his wife and marry another and it not be adultery? Jesus says, except for one thing. That's fornication. So he who divorces his wife, except for fornication, and marries another, commits adultery. Well, that would be understood then. He who divorces his wife for fornication and marries another is not committing adultery. Now, we already learned in Matthew 5 and verse 32 that you cannot marry someone who has been put away without committing adultery. That's where, in conjunction with this, that we say that the guilty party cannot remarry. He has forfeited the right to remarry through his infidelity. The way of the sinner is hard. And now you're talking about a 21-year-old man that runs off on his wife, and she divorces him for it. Denny, are you meaning to say that he's got to live single the rest of his life? So, well, what I have to say about it is irrelevant. What did Jesus say? The one that marries the person that's been put away commits adultery, as does the person that marries commits adultery. That's what Jesus teaches. And it's not rocket science to understand what Jesus said, either here or in that passage there. Baptism doesn't change that. It doesn't wash away the consequences of adultery, as we learned with Herod and Herodias in Matthew 14. Now, unfortunately, it's been my experience that a lot of people have ended the discussion with verse 9. That is a huge mistake. The discussion continues. Verse 10, the disciples said to him, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry. Now, note, first of all, they understood what Jesus had just said. Jesus had laid down a teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage that was a mind-blowing, wow, did we just hear that right? Teaching. They saw a definite rigidity, an inflexibility in what Jesus had to say. To the extent that if you are going to be bound to this woman for the rest of your life, and you can't get out of that marriage save for her being sexually unfaithful, then maybe you'd be better off not marrying at all. The prospect of being locked into an unhappy marriage for the rest of your life is what they're talking about. They got what Jesus was saying. And they're saying, if that's the way it is, then it might be better off not to marry at all, Jesus. Now, this may not be the best way to approach this, but try to understand that what I'm going to say from this point on is that there would have been no reason for the disciples to have said what they said if Jesus was allowing divorce and remarriage for any cause. If that's what Jesus was saying, would the disciples have replied, then it's better not to marry? Well, that's ridiculous. Of course not. There would have been no need for the disciples' statement if Jesus was merely talking about covenant breaking, which only requires repentance. I lied, God, please forgive me. Okay, I'm forgiven. Now I move on and I try not to lie anymore. Well, I committed adultery and I divorced her, and now I'm married again. God forgive me, and I'll try to make this marriage a better one. Oh, you'd be better off not to marry. That's ridiculous. The way the disciples would have said that if all Jesus was referring to was covenant breaking. There would have been no need for the statement if Jesus was allowing the guilty party to marry after repentance. This would allow one to get out of a marriage and remarry someone else, whether they were innocent or guilty. And the point is, God never lets you benefit from your own sin. All right, so George knows that if he commits adultery, Mary's going to divorce him. Well, he doesn't want to be married to her anymore anyway. So he goes out and he commits adultery. She finds out, and as he predicted, she divorces him. Now I'm free, and I can marry another. So it worked out beautifully, just the way you planned. I wanted to get rid of Mary. I wanted to marry Susie. So I commit adultery. She divorces me. You're not ever going to be able to benefit from your own sin. And for those that teach that, yeah, you were the guilty party, and she divorced you for that, and We're sorry for that, but, God's forgiven you, and now you can move on. Well, why can't I be calculated and say, all right, if I can be forgiven for this, then I'm going to go ahead and commit adultery. And I know that my wife will divorce me, which is what I want, which frees me to marry someone else. So in the long run, you've benefited from your own sin. All right, here is a point that I make frequently and would encourage you also to do the same. When you encounter the teachings that are running rampant in the church today, and you see men like Edwards and Olin Hicks, who have made a name for themselves with their teaching on marriage, divorce, remarriage, ask the question, if what you are teaching about marriage and divorce and remarriage is true, would the disciples have responded the way they did to your teaching, to what you're saying verse 9 means? And I guarantee you that the answer to that is no, they wouldn't. If you don't have a doctrine on marriage, divorce, and remarriage that has the clear rigidity, inflexibility of Jesus' teaching that elicits the response that the disciples gave, then you don't have verse 9 right. You don't have it right. Jesus didn't give any wiggle room except for one solitary little point, fornication, not a little point, but point. You see, the disciples had been surrounded with, if she burns a dish, if you find someone prettier, that's the environment they were brought up in. That's the teaching that they were hearing. And now here comes Jesus and says, one reason only, sexual unfaithfulness. Other than that, anything beyond that, that's adultery. Wow. Maybe you better not get married at all. Your position, whatever you end up with, had better be a position that would have elicited a response from the disciples like they gave in verse 10. And I guarantee you, the teachings that Hicks and Edwards and these other guys are given, the disciples would have said, man, all right, sounds pretty good. But that's not the way they replied. And unless you're going to argue the disciples completely missed what Jesus said, which that would be ludicrous to even try to go there, then they got it right. And they understood exactly what Jesus had said. So we ask the question, does baptism allow one to stay in an unscriptural marriage? The answer is no, it doesn't. John the Baptist didn't offer that option to Herod and Herodias. They were in an unscriptural marriage in Matthew 14. Baptism does not make an unholy marriage a holy one. All right, what about 1 Corinthians 7:15? All right, Paul says that if the unbeliever wants to leave, let him leave. You are not under bondage in such cases. So doesn't that provide a second reason on top of what Jesus is teaching. First of all, you need to know that Paul does not use the word for the marriage bond in 1 Corinthians 7:15. He does use the word that is used to refer to the marriage bond in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 27, and 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39, and in Romans 7 and verse 2, but that is not the word that he uses in 7:15. So, to say that you are not under bondage and make that to mean you're no longer in the marriage bond, that bond is broken, is running further with the teaching of 1 Corinthians 7:15 than the actual words allow. Plus, Paul uses a verb tense, which is called a perfect participle. That means, with the negative, is not now and was not true in the past. So if someone wants to say you are not under bondage, and the bondage means the marriage vow, marriage bond, then now you have Paul saying, you've never been married. You've never been bound to that person. Well, that is exactly contradictory of what he said in verse 14. Because they're saying, the believer is asking the question, I'm married to an unbeliever. Does God want me to break this marriage up? And Paul says, no, absolutely not. So why would he turn right around in verse 15 and say, you've never been married? There's never been that marriage bond. But that's not what he's saying. He's not saying that you were never married, because that would have Paul telling the Christian, you are not married now, and you have never been married. That makes no sense. Now, Paul had already given two options regarding the prospect of a second marriage in verse 11. He's not going to regurgitate the point that he had already made 4 verses earlier. He says a wife should not leave her husband. But if she leaves, the word leave there means divorce. A wife should not divorce her husband. But if she does, she's got 2 options. Remain unmarried or to be reconciled to her husband. There's no third option of marrying another man. So in verse 15, you've got a believer married to an unbeliever. The unbeliever wants to leave. Let him leave. You're not under bondage. Well, what does he mean under bondage? He uses a word there that means a slave. You are not a slave to that person. You're not tied to him or her with a chain. You don't have to follow them around like a little puppy, even though they don't want you anymore. You're a Christian. They don't want to be married to a Christian. You're not under bondage. You don't have to be a slave to that person and follow them around. But, so what are your options? remain unmarried, or to be reconciled with that person. That's what he already had said in verse 11. But people call this the Pauline privilege. You have unchastity or sexual unfaithfulness in Matthew 19:9, and then you've got a second reason given by the inspired Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7:15. But it's been my experience that very, very, very few people actually hold the line on what 7:15 is saying. And that is desertion. That you have a non-Christian who has deserted the Christian. And now they're saying that that Christian has the right to remarry. Well, the marriage just fell apart. Incompatibility. They just couldn't get along. Blah, blah, blah. It was Pauline privilege. No, Paul is talking about the unbelieving one leaves. But they want to open up the application to a lot of other things other than desertion, where the unbeliever deserts the believer. Well, but even that isn't what he's teaching. As if you can follow what I'm saying, that's still not right. But even if it were right, where there are people that are making a lot broader application to that than what verse 15 would actually allow, if in fact he was talking about the marriage bond. Okay. We have to make marriage as a lifelong commitment and be faithful to our vows. And we have to recognize that heaven is our goal. And marriage is such that we've got to make sure that we're in obedience to the gospel. All right, I'm going to flip through this real quick and get to verse 12. Okay, we're not ready for verse 12 quite yet, but verse 11. But he said to them, not all men can accept this statement. All right, what he means, and I'm going to turn that off because you guys are not listening to me. You're typing what's on the screen. We're not in verse 12. We're in verse 11. Not all men can accept this statement. He's talking about what the disciples just said. It's better not to marry. Not all men can accept that. What you just said. As a matter of fact, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7 that to keep fornication, let each man take his own wife. God made men sexual creatures. He made us where we want to have a sexual relationship. And then he created a parameter on which that particular desire that he created in us can be fulfilled. Marriage. All right. So not all men can accept this statement. Not all men can say, yeah, I can live without a woman. Well, actually, most men couldn't accept that statement. But to him to whom it is given, those who can hear the statement and they've got the fortitude to make that choice and say, I can live single. Then, when we get to verse 12, we have a eunuch illustration. A eunuch is someone who is not going to have sexual relations. Now, a eunuch is a perfect illustration here because Jesus is going to talk about somebody who can't have sex. All right, so there are three types of eunuchs. Three types of men that will not have sex. First, Jesus says there are those that are born that way. Now, from a physical point of view, and Jesus is not really talking about physical eunuchs, he's using them as an illustration. But from a physical point of view, here is a male child that is born maybe without all of the necessary parts in order to have sexual intercourse. And so he's going to be a eunuch. He's not ever going to have sex because of the way he was born. Well, this is reference to someone that's never going to get married. And it could be either because of choice, or it could be because they are incapable. Now, think of someone who obviously fits in this first category in the New Testament. Paul does. Paul was one that made a choice to live his entire life as a eunuch. All right, so he's an example of someone that would fit in this first category. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but look in your Bibles and tell me what the first word of verse 12 is. For. All right, Nathan, what does that mean? If a sentence begins with for, grammatically, that demands what?
Not sure.
Okay, somebody want to help him?
Means that you have to go back and look at what came before that to see what it was in reference to.
Okay, so we're continuing context, right? We're not jumping to a new topic. So we've been talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and now he's talking about eunuchs. Is he changing topics? No. For, let me give you an illustration. Let me demonstrate through this illustration what I'm talking about. The disciples said, it'd be better not to marry. Jesus says, well, there are some that can choose to do that. Not all men can accept that statement, but there are some who can. And then second, he says there are some that are made eunuchs by men. Okay, let's talk about the literal part of this, and then we'll talk about the application to marriage that Jesus is making here. Kings wanted queens to be protected. And having women protect them was never a good idea because the women were not strong enough and militarily trained. And so he needed men to protect the queen. But he didn't want those men to have sexual desires for the queen. And they were going to see the queen in all contexts, when she's bathing, when she's sleeping. And so what are you going to do to have the strength of a man protect a woman, but he doesn't want to have that man have sexual desires? You make him a eunuch. And so that's what kings would do. They would send their soldiers among the populace of the cities, and they would find big, strong, strapping men, and they would make them eunuchs and put them in the service of the king, more specifically to take care of the queen. Now, did they volunteer for that duty? Did they say, this is something I'd like to volunteer for? No. They were made that way. All right, so in a marriage context now, what is the application to that? It's not their fault. They can't get married because of the choice of another. Okay, let me illustrate. Let's suppose that I go home tonight and Kathy's got her bags packed and she says, I'm tired of being married to you. This is such a far out illustration, I know, but tired of being married to you. There's not another man. I don't even have a relationship with anybody else. I just don't want to be married anymore. I'm out of here. What are my options as far as a sexual future?
Get back together with her.
Yeah. I mean, it's either her or it's nobody. And so if this departure on her part is permanent, then I've just been made a eunuch. It's not my fault. It's not what I wanted. But it is the reality of where I am right now. That's what Jesus is talking about. Sometimes there are those that are made eunuchs by men. The only way that I can have sex with another woman is if she was sexually unfaithful, and I divorced her because of that, and married another. If that's not the one reason, then I have no right to have a sexual relationship with someone else. So, she's made me a eunuch. I have to live as a eunuch from that point on. That's what Jesus is referring to. Remember, and then he talks about, we're still talking about marriage situations. And then third, there are those that make themselves a eunuch. He says, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Now, there are those that did not do quality exegetical work and have thought that Jesus was actually complimenting those that would have the fortitude to make themselves a eunuch. And you remember hearing the name Origen in church history. Well, Origen took a couple of rocks and made himself a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom, only to find out later that really wasn't what Jesus meant. All right, so in our illustration of marriage, what would be a scenario where a person would make himself a eunuch? The guilty party. All right, so here is a man, he commits adultery. His wife divorces him because of his sexual unfaithfulness. What are his options from that point on? He has made himself one that can no longer have sexual relations. Because of his bad choices, his one sexual partner that was God approved has left him. For the sake of the kingdom, he makes himself a eunuch. Not literally, but as far as being one that can have a sexual relationship from that point on. Now, according to this verse, why would he do that? So he can go to heaven. Because he knows that if I have sex with another woman, then that's fornication, and according to 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and Galatians chapter 5, those who practice such things shall not inherit the kingdom of heaven. So, if I mess up and Kathy divorces me because I was sexually unfaithful to her, then I've made myself a eunuch. If I want to go to heaven, now, see, that is all in reply to Jesus' teaching and the disciples' response. And so you've got to understand verse 12 in the context of marriage. Jesus isn't launching off on some bizarre, completely irrelevant discussion of eunuchs. By the way, there are actually 3 types of eunuchs. You ever thought about that? No, it has application. And if you want to talk about those who cannot have a sexual relationship, there are 3. 3 possibilities. And so eunuchs fit that description. All right. Questions? Scenarios? Nathan?
A couple questions. First, how does Paul fit into the born that way category?
Yeah.
Then, I mean,
He doesn't in the born that way in the sense that a literal application of a eunuch, but that you've got to have a kind of a special makeup and mindset.
Okay, my second question. What about a person who enters into a marriage under false pretenses? What I mean by that is, and I know this was a case back home, a lady married a guy and divorced, and then later on she was wanting to remarry another person. And when getting into it, she said, well, first guy I married, she didn't want to say this. She said, we never had a sexual relationship. I thought that we had a good relationship. We never did before we got married. When we got married, he refused because he told me he was attracted to men. So is she free to remarry? Did I get a point for stumping you?
Well, I don't know that I'm stumped. I just would say that I'm not sure that you would be wise to counsel on that. Either way, because
Oh, I did.
If you're asking him, you're not wise to counsel.
I didn't give counsel. She had already done this, and she did. And she got married.
so in her mind it was okay, and she had
Yeah,
acted on.
yeah. I didn't give her counsel. In fact, she did talk to me about it, and I told her I didn't think she should just because I didn't know. Then she found somebody else who said that he thought it was okay, so he did. And I thought it was not okay for another reason as well, regarding the man she was marrying. But anyway, but in her case, personally, I was like, I don't know.
Yeah, because the only biblical points that could be made is what was in your mind when the marriage was formed.
I know it was in her mind, but if the man had misled her, I don't know. I mean, you talked about the young couple that got married for a different purpose. And this man got married for a different purpose because he was trying to hide his true sexual struggles, and he never apparently had a homosexual relationship, but he wanted to kind of mask that he even had
Yeah,
one.
see how that opens up the door for all kinds of abuse. He never really did love me. He never really was committed to this marriage. Now all of a sudden, you're putting all these parameters. I entered marriage with the best of ideas and pretenses, but that wasn't where he was coming from. Therefore, it's like I say, that's dangerous water, and I'm not gonna go there.
You're not gonna swim in it.